I know a lot of people in this room, but for those of you who don't know me, my name's Dawn Elise Mooney, and I'm an archaeobotanist based at the University of Stavanger in Norway. So yeah, I'm going to talk today about why archaeologists are so bad at recognizing or exploring past utilization of plants and what we can do about it. So I want to start with getting you to think about, if you were to look around this room, look at what you're wearing, the things you have with you, think about how many of those items or those objects in the past would have been made from plants, especially things that are made from synthetic fibers or plastics. So there's a few obvious ones that we're quite good at looking into in archaeology. We're quite good at finding evidence of food, especially cultivated plants. We're good at looking into what people used for fuel, and we're kind of okay at finding remains of the shelters or the building materials that they used, although kind of depends on the preservation conditions. But then, of course, there are tools and vessels and other artifacts that would have been made of plant material, especially wood here in Iceland. There's cordage and textiles. And even if you're making cordage and textiles from animal fibers, you're still probably using plants to make dyes and pigments to color those. We're also getting resins like tar from plants. And then as well, you're using plants for medicines and in ritual elements. Not to mention, decor and ornaments, or, both personal decor and in houses or structures. And many of these categories overlap as well. There's things can be food, but also medicine, or decoration, but also ritual. And I'm afraid to say that you all in this room have been quite publicly accused of being not bothered about archaeological plant remains. So this was written in 2014 that most Icelandic archaeologists see little value in macrobotanical data when it comes to addressing current problems in Icelandic archaeology. This is from the Hrísbrú publication, the Mosfell Archaeological Project monograph. And I disagree so vehemently with this statement. Working with Icelandic archaeologists inspired my research career as an archaeobotanist. Although there weren't many people doing archaeobotany actively in Iceland, I never experienced a lack of interest in the work that I was doing or a sense that it wasn't valued. So even when this statement was published over a decade ago, it was demonstrably wrong. There are things missing from the bibliography that really should be there and would have, demonstrated that plants are being explored in Icelandic archaeology. But then even more so in the decades since, there have been many important works carried out addressing human-plant interactions in the Icelandic past. However, it is true that these studies are not often very visible in the archaeological literature. And are not often as well integrated as studies focusing on artifacts, for example, or even other ecofacts like animal bones. And this is no means an Icelandic problem. I currently work in Norway, and there is, Ramona will attest to this as well, much less awareness of environmental archaeology in general than there is here in Iceland. So you're definitely, doing fairly well in the grand scheme of things here. But still, we're all starting from a kind of disadvantage here because of this concept called plant blindness. So this is an idea that's from plant biology and conservation biology, and it basically encompasses the widespread lack of awareness of plants and neglect of plants. And it's posited that this was originally an evolutionary advantage. We are descended from the people who saw a tiger here rather than focusing on the grass. So we're kind of used to seeing plants as a background. They're not usually an immediate threat. They don't usually require us to make any immediate action. And this is it's an issue for conservation because plants obviously aren't as charismatic as tigers or polar bears or other large endangered mammals. So it's quite difficult to get people to care about endangered plant species. And it's also quite difficult to get some archaeologists to care about plants. And I think we're particularly vulnerable to plant blindness because of the really specific preservation conditions that many plant remains require. And also the fact that we need to sample so carefully to actually retrieve this material. So, I mean, if you look at this diagram here, you've probably all seen versions of this. I'm going to point out that it seems to have lost the key at some point, but these brown squares and these grey leaves, those represent charcoal and charred plant remains. And you can see that those are found everywhere. So they're probably the most common class of archaeological material, full stop. But other, non-charred plant remains are much less easy to find. And because of the sampling that needs to be done as well, and the then microscopy that needs to be done to identify these remains, they're kind of perceived as being difficult. And I'm going to come back to this later, like what is it about plants that make us think that seeds, for example, are more difficult to identify than animal bones or than different types of flint tools, for example. But going back to the idea of preservation, I just remind everyone, as I did at the start, that the past was organic. Like on most sites, it's estimated that only about 5% of the material record survives. This is an example from Scotland, where they're very lucky that a huge amount of the material record survives. You can see all of the exposed roofing structure of a collapsed Iron Age longhouse here. But you can see that's mostly sort of twigs and other small wooden elements. And I would say that a significant proportion of that 95% of material that doesn't survive is plants. And so when we're looking into what plants we find in archaeological remains, archaeological sites, we need to remember that it's not only preservation that is filtering those remains. There's also societal filters, so what plants were brought into the site, how were they used, have any parts of the plant been culturally modified? For charred assemblages, we have to think about combustion filters. How likely is this plant part to come into contact with fire? Will it survive the charring process? There are then taphonomic or depositional filters. So are the preservations good enough to allow plant remains to be preserved, or will the depositional context be disturbed? And then we create our own filters as well. So the kind of samples we take, how we process them, all affect the likelihood that different kinds of plant remains will be recovered through these sampling strategies. And then lastly, the way we interpret these remains also puts filters on it. And I'm going to talk about this in a bit more detail as well here, but I want to think just a little here about, or point out this idea of when does an ecofact become an artifact? So when does something that's made of plant or animal material start becoming an artifact? Because we tend to treat these categories in very different ways, but actually we can apply a lot of the same interpretive or theoretical ideas to both classes together. So yeah, pollen remains go through a similar set of filters, but I am not a pollen specialist, so I'm not going to talk about that at all. I'm going to talk about, or focus on, charred plant remains in particular. Also because waterlogged plant remains are so rare in comparison to charcoal and charred seeds, which I've said already are probably the most abundant class of archaeological material, full stop, in the North Atlantic. But as well as missing material, we might also be missing practices that we couldn't construct without traditional knowledge. So this is an example that I found a few years ago, and I think this is fascinating. There are some native groups in Alaska and Russia that have this subsistence strategy where they gather so-called mouse roots. So this is where rodents have collected together tubers and roots and stem bases from plants and brought them into caches for the winter. And humans will find these caches, collect the plant material, and give a gift of meat or fish, or even a kind of spiritual gift like tobacco instead. And then these communities are giving something like meat or fish that they have in abundance to collect plant remains which have vitamins and minerals and other things that they're not getting from their diet. They're eaten, yeah, then boiled or with sea mammal fat or blood. And this was considered to be a delicacy or like a fun thing to eat in the people interviewed for this project. So this is such a complicated like human plant animal relationship, and it really illustrates the potential complexity of past foodways. And it also shows us how open we need to be to potential taphonomic pathways. Like if we were lucky enough to find a cache of these tubers on an archaeological site, how would we interpret them? Are they nature or culture? As practice is undoubtedly difficult to identify and reconstruct, but the question of whether archaeobotany in itself is particularly difficult, I would argue, is more debatable. So I'm going to joke here that, of course, my job is so easy, anyone could do it. But obviously, I'm not here to say that. I would like to still have a job at the end of this. But I want to encourage people to think about why we tend to see some branches of archaeology as more or less challenging than others. And I propose that this is partly because of how we define archaeology and partly because of the extra steps involved in collecting archaeobotanical data. So it's very true that there is a difference between finding a spindle whorl or a stone tool or any artifact versus recovering ecofacts. So at the most, smaller artifacts might require sieving to recover them, whereas archaeobotany and the recovery of most ecofacts involves carefully planned sampling. So maybe on site you see some charcoal, but in most cases you don't know that your samples will be successful. The samples need to be processed and analysed before you know what you have. So there's this lack of immediacy. You generally don't get the archaeobotanical results during an excavation. So it's harder to know if you found some seeds than if you found a potsherd, for example. So that's kind of easy. But what about stratigraphy or recognizing a post hole or understanding what is collapse versus what is a turf wall? These are skills that involve years of training. Like a random person on the street could probably tell you that a potsherd is a broken piece of pottery, but there's no guarantee that two professional archaeologists will interpret the same soil profile in the same way. But we all agree that being able to interpret stratigraphy is a tool that all archaeologists should have. But while we would expect most archaeologists to be able to recognize a potsherd, we would not necessarily expect them to be able to recognize a grain of barley, even though these two find categories arguably have the same importance in human history. So I'm here to argue that the difference between recognizing a particular kind of artifact and recognizing a seed has nothing to do with the relative difficulty of these tasks and everything to do with how we categorize archaeology. And this is particularly true in traditions where archaeology is firmly positioned within the humanities, as is the case here at Háskóli Íslands and as is the case in Norway. And so in recognizing different types of, for example, flint tools versus different cereal grains, we use the same techniques and the same mental pathways. We look for morphological characteristics and compare what we observe to published reference material and to our own experience of working with these materials. However, we apply this nature-culture divide in saying that the differences between two flint tools is down to how a human has shaped those tools, whereas the difference between two seeds is natural. Except, of course, in the example given here, differences are not natural. They're the products of thousands of years of human selection for larger grains or other characteristics. So while I'm not saying that everyone can or should be an archaeobotanist, like different material types and different patterns connect better with different people. So an archaeologist might be great at understanding stratigraphy, but terrible at recognizing different kinds of pottery, or able to identify every single bone in the human body, but only the most basic categories of stone tools. So the specialisms that we choose don't make us more or less archaeologists. I'd also like to argue briefly that actually everything we find on an archaeological site is culturally modified. And if we start thinking in this way, we open up for a much broader interpretation of what material is of cultural significance. And that in turn gives us access to more aspects of past plant use. So it allows us to explore plant use beyond staple cereal crops in daily life. I'd argue that understanding past cultivation or past consumption of cereal crops is the absolute basic minimum for exploring human-plant interactions in the North Atlantic. And even plant use in food is broader. So think about how people used or exploited fruits or leafy vegetables or flavorings. Looking into plants or plant use also allows us to access gender issues, like gathering of plant foods or wild plant foods is often a female domain in many societies. And folk medicine is often gendered. You know, there's this idea of where is the boundary between a healer and a witch. And certain branches of medicine will be female rather than male. So we can, you know, there are potential things. This is all, you know, can be difficult to draw out. But again, I'm asking you to kind of think widely, kind of think outside the box here. And I think it also gives us an opportunity to explore modern environmental issues. So understanding the past exploitation of biodiversity can help us feel more connected to nature, because we're very disconnected now, right? Again, like I was saying, plastics have replaced a lot of what would have been plant materials in our daily lives. So I'm not going to go into this in detail, but I do want to just bring up this point that I think environmental archaeology has huge potential to combat shifting baseline syndrome, to actually make us understand better what the environment was like in the past and why that was important for people. So, finally getting to the point, how can we combat plant blindness? And I'm going to say there are two approaches here when I think about theory, so changing how we think about the plant remains that we already recover, and methodology, exploring how different methods can give us new insights. So if we define theory as being the lens through which we interpret data, many people approach so-called scientific data, such as plant remains, from what they consider to be an objective perspective. However, I would argue that there is interpretation, so the employment of a theoretical approach, at every stage in our analysis of ecofacts as well. And I've already talked about how dualism, like the nature-culture divide, affects our perception of to what extent we consider classes of material to be archaeological or environmental. But we apply the same dualism in how we categorize plants and how we interpret archaeobotanical assemblages. So many studies of past human-plant interactions have focused on cultivated plants, especially those cultivated for their seeds. However, many elements of the way that we categorize plants or classify plants were not necessarily applicable in the past. So even modern taxonomy is interpretation. Plants that we scientifically know to be different species might not have been classified in the same way by past populations. We can't know that the categories into which we put plant remains, for example, cultivated plants, weeds, wild plants, had the same relevance for people in the past. So amongst others, Rebecca Blakeney and colleagues in a 2023 paper that I'll show later have argued that we need an ontological approach to understanding, to interpreting past plant use. That means understanding that the meanings and significances that we attribute to plants today didn't necessarily apply in the past. And it also means not necessarily making value judgments based on what modern science knows. So we can, of course, for example, prove that a traditional home remedy doesn't have an effect, but that doesn't mean this remedy wasn't used in the past and that we should ignore its potential significance to the people whose remains we're interpreting. And I'll admit that this approach is difficult, especially in early prehistory. It requires an openness to the potential of the material that can seem very much at odds to the way we're used to constructing interpretations. It's also not an invitation to speculate wildly without any basis. You've got to find a middle ground here. But thinking about how people in the past might have constructed their knowledge allows us to interrogate why we know what we think we know and how our own assumptions might be biasing our interpretations. So we can take practical steps towards this by using available knowledge about pre-industrial folk botany, for example. Björn Halldorsson's Grasnytjar is an excellent source for late 18th century Iceland. And we can also consider like the context in which plants grew in the past and what that might tell us about their usefulness. Like I'm bringing up this example here. This is a picture of Lansay Meadows. And looking at the turf roofs here on the reconstructed longhouses, we're inclined to think that either they're covered in pretty wildflowers or in messy weeds. But it's worth considering that actually turf roofs and other similar small spaces within settlements were probably intentionally gardened to encourage useful or symbolic plants in the past. Now, this all brings us to the question of weeds, which I've brought up a couple of times as well. And this is an extremely common category in archaeobotanical assemblages. And as you're hopefully seeing now, while many studies treat weeds as if they are a natural and self-evident category, the idea of a weed is in fact a very cultural concept. So a weed is simply a plant in the wrong place. But how do we know that past communities considered these plants to be unwelcome? We might also see these plants called ruderal or apophytic plants, so plants that grow in nutrient-rich, disturbed ground around human settlements and fields. And certainly weeds can take away some of the water and nutrients intended for cultivated plants, but that doesn't mean that they're without benefits. So assemblages of what we consider to be weeds in archaeobotanical material are often considered to represent either waste from cereal processing or to be a sign of a bad infested crop. But if we call a plant a weed, we're actually masking its potential other roles. So a good example here is Chenopodium album, known as fat hen in English, or Hjellunjóli in Icelandic, I think. It's not native to Iceland, but it grows very commonly in Europe, and it's very common in archaeobotanical assemblages. It's also one of my pet peeves, as it has thousands of these little tiny black seeds, and it's really hard to tell whether they're charred or not, and it's actually important to know when there are thousands of them in your sample. But in any case, it was initially a coastal plant, and then sometime in the Neolithic, it becomes synanthropic, so it starts to grow on middens and around settlements. From this, at some point, it actually starts to be cultivated to some sort of rough extent for its seeds. So you might be able to tell, looking at these seeds, that the plant is closely related to quinoa. So they're quite nutritious, protein-rich seeds. And they were quite widely eaten. So an example, a sort of famous example, is that the stomach contents of the Tolland man bog body included seeds of this plant. However, more recently, the fact that it can produce 50 million seeds per hectare means that it's a very competitive weed in modern agriculture, and it's been controlled with pesticides. However, its fortunes are now changing again, and the leaves and young stems are also edible, and they're more and more being collected by foragers. So, is it a weed or is it a crop? Is it a useful plant or is it just a nuisance? We need to be clear that the role of plants in modern agriculture was not their role in the past. And speaking of modern agriculture, we also need to be aware of how domesticated plants are modified. So plants that are cultivated for their seeds end up with bigger, more nutritious seeds that are very easily identifiable. However, selection for other plants and parts of the plant is unlikely to have any impact on how the seeds look. So all the vegetables shown here are technically the same species, and in identifying the seeds from archaeological sites, we often can't get any further than Brassica family. And this picture often really surprises native English speakers because not only do the plants look different, but the names we have for them also don't indicate that they're related. Now, this is actually much clearer in Icelandic and in Scandinavian languages, where these plants are all types of kål or kál. So in terms of past plant use, these plants would have all played a similar role in diet. And we could argue that thinking of them all as types of kale is much more relevant than trying to figure out if people are eating turnips or cauliflowers. We won't see that in the archaeobotanical assemblages, but we might see that a past community had access to leafy green vegetables in the Brassica family, And given what we know about these, we can be fairly certain that they were being eaten. So amongst plant uses, the use of plants for medicinal and ritual purposes is particularly hard to access. So medicine plants lie at a crossroads of all the issues that I've raised here. It's often the soft plants of the parts of the plant rather than the seeds that are used. They're used in relatively small quantities, and they're not generally directly cultivated in the same way as cereals and vegetables. So there's very few pathways for seeds of these plants to find their way into archaeobotanical assemblages to become charred and then preserved. There's more chance of finding indications of these plants in the pollen record, but we still need to know how to interpret them. And there are very few written records of early folk medicine, so we can't be sure that these plants were used in the same way in the past. However, in the medieval period, we have places where we know for a fact that medicinal plants are being used. So the archaeological and botanical remains from monasteries can provide a relatively safe space to explore medicinal plant use. Monasteries can always be like a gateway drug to thinking more broadly about plant use. We have written records and herbals that can provide information about plant use and be directly connected with the archaeological plant remains we find. And there's relatively little uncertainty. We know the function of these sites, and so it's much easier to contextualize what otherwise might be more ambiguous plant remains. And some really good work has been done on this project by the Kortlagning á Íslandi project. Identifying pollen and relic populations of medicinal plants. Similar work has also been carried out in Norway. However, still, when talking about some of these plants, we come back to the idea that we should aim to be certain of the interpretations we propose. So I'm going to quote you here, Scott, that it's impossible to say with certainty that their presence in pollen assemblages from archaeological contexts is exclusively down to human agency. And, fine, that's very true. But I'd also suggest that when we know from contemporary sources that a plant had medical applications, and we know that it was growing in the immediate vicinity of a site where medicine was practiced, that's getting pretty close to certain by our archaeological standards, at least. So I wondered if it's harder to identify medicinal plant use outside of like monastic context or context where we know that medicine was taking place. How might we take the ideas that Blakeney and Al proposed about changing our sort of ontological, or having an ontological approach, and apply them to secular and domestic contexts? So if we move away from considering plants as accidental inclusions passively entering the archaeological record, we can start thinking about how human action might have resulted in the inclusion of these remains. So with that in mind, I went back to the published assemblage of plant remains from Hrísbrú, from the quote that I read at the start, to see if there were other trends that we might draw out based on the reported finds. And actually the seeds and other plant parts that are recovered from Hrísbrú are really typical for Viking Age plant assemblages in Western Iceland. So this reassessment, sort of miniature reassessment, could be applied to a lot of sites. The only cultivated plant is barley. It's a quite small quantity actually compared to contemporary sites in Reykjavik. I've included grasses here as well as cultivated, because even having talked about not categorizing things, I still can't resist it, obviously. But we need to think as well about whether it was only grass that was desirable as hay. So plants like Stellaria, Spergula, Rumex, and Polygonum are plants that grow on disturbed ground, and they would have been collected from the home field as hay fodder as well. But many of these, again, are also edible. The leaves of Stellaria and Rumex, and then the berries of crowberry as well, have been widely used in the past and are all foraged in the present. Many of these are also medicinal plants. So viola was only found as a single example at this site, but it's a widely used medicinal plant with a range of applications, especially for coughs and other illnesses of the chest, as well as for skin complaints. also this other berry, bearberry, Arctostaphylos, which is used in both European and Native American folk medicine as like a general health tonic, and its leaves are included in many preparations. Stellaria, rumex, and polygonum are all known in folk medicine from Iceland and Scandinavia, again, often with this sort of general idea that they're cleansing or healing in a broad sense. So Spergilla arvensis is the only plant named here that doesn't have an application in food, medicine, or craft, but nevertheless it was considered to be a good fodder in historic times in Norway as well. So by thinking about these plants in terms of their potential uses, especially those which are historically or ethnographically attested, we get much closer to understanding how the inhabitants of the site would have seen their surrounding environments. Now, for us, fields and pharmacies are very different concepts, but it's important to remember that it wasn't so in the past. And I want to just note as well that I'm not just here to throw shade at other people. I've been just as guilty of ignoring plants that would have been important to people in the Viking Age. At Lækjargata, in interpreting the macrofossil assemblage there, I completely overlooked the potential medical use of Horbladka in Icelandic, Menianthes trifoliata, which is extremely widely used in folk medicine, as well as a range of other species. However, this plant is also used as a flavouring in brewing, and it grows in wet environments, which were abundant at Lækjargata and around Tjörnin. So was it medicine, was it brewing, was it part of the natural environment? We need to think about, or keep in mind, that these multiple potential meanings can actually translate to a multiplicity of uses. So, as well as changing how we think about plants, we can change how we sample for them and our expectations about what kinds of plant remains we'll find. So microbotany, especially the study of phytoliths and starch grains, has been used extensively in areas where leaves or starchy tubers have been culturally more important than cereal crops. And I want to stress that neither of these methods are new as such, but they are underutilized in Northern European archaeology. Even though our economies have focused on cereal crops, these methods can help us find evidence of plants that were used for their roots or leaves, and can also help us find cereals in contexts where we otherwise wouldn't find charred grain. So very briefly, phytoliths are, well, you know when you run your finger along the edge of a blade of grass and it feels kind of sharp? That's because of phytoliths. So plants take up silica from the groundwater and deposit it in certain cells. When the plant dies and decays, these silica structures in the shape of plant cells remain, and they're identifiable to species. So they've been used to identify where different kinds of banana have been cultivated, or what stone tools have been used to cut or grind plant leaves or stems. And cereal crops also have really characteristic phytoliths. So these have been used to identify areas where threshing has taken place, or even when offerings of grain, like fresh grain, have been placed in graves. I'm not going to go into detail about phytoliths. I'm going to talk a little bit more about starch grains. These are the internal structures in which plants store starch, and their shape and morphology can help us identify them to species. We don't really know why they preserve where they do, but they can be recovered from soils, from tools, from the inside of vessels, and even from our teeth. And they even change as well when they're cooked or fermented, so it's possible to determine whether they come from raw or processed plants. And there was a really cool study, yes, a couple of years ago now, from of dental calculus from 11th century burials from Keflavik and Keltidalur in Skagafjörður, which found starch grains from a whole range of wild plants, suggesting that people were eating brassicas, bilberries, silverweed, angelica, and dulse, so söl, along with cereals. And interestingly, these are all plants that grow really widely in Iceland, but are extremely rare in archaeobotanical assemblages. So we can already see that there's this big difference in what plant types we recover when looking at different categories of plant remains. However, recovering starch grains from dental calculus or from soils can involve a lot of work, as the plant remains need to be very carefully extracted from this mineral matrix they're set in. But it's actually very, very easy to sample for starch grains from artifacts or vessels. And this method's been used on ceramics and can show where foods like porridge and beer have been present. However, of course, again, it's a little bit more difficult for the Viking Age North Atlantic because most vessels used for storage and fermentation and dining were made from wood. So, along with my colleagues Eli Panta and Shaylin Prado, we were lucky enough to get some funding from the World Wood Day Foundation to look into whether a starch grain analysis might help us better understand the use of wooden artifacts in the past of the North Atlantic. This also is important because chemical organic residue analysis doesn't work on wooden artifacts. The organic compounds in the wood mask and overwhelm any other signatures. But this shouldn't be the case with starch grains. So the process of sampling artifacts for starch grains is very simple. We use a small amount of water and actually a Korean-style sonic facial cleanser, which is it's a weird bit of kit, but it works. Kind of gently lift the botanical remains from the surface of the vessel. However, of course, wooden artifacts are fragile, and most have undergone very careful conservation to remove all the moisture from them and make them stable. So as you can imagine, museums have been a bit reluctant in letting us test this method on their collections. So what we've done to start off here is to take samples from modern wooden objects used for processing plants. So this is everything from wooden spoons that my colleagues have used to make rice pudding to buckets used for dyeing textiles in experimental archaeology. And we're still waiting for the results of this work to come together, so I can only say watch this space. But also, if you excavate any wooden vessels, we would love to sample them before they undergo conservation. So the same also goes for soapstone vessels, actually. So if you're interested or if you have anything, then let me know or contact me by email. And yeah, I hope this hasn't sounded like some airy-fairy post-truth nonsense. But I hope that it kind of provokes thoughts and discussions. And I'd be super happy to answer any questions. But before I do, I want to just do a tiny bit of advertising. And that is for anyone working on plant remains in Icelandic archaeology, or any of you who have partnerships with people abroad who are working on plant remains from Iceland. You'd be very welcome to join the next Nordic Archaeobotany Group meeting, which will be in 2026, so a little way away, in Vilnius in Lithuania. So do also contact me if you would like to know more about that. So yeah, thank you again to the organizers, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much.